When Samia Suluhu Hassan became president of Tanzania in 2021, following the death of her predecessor, she carried with her a rare promise in East Africa: the possibility of change. But now, in late 2025, that promise lies battered, under the weight of accusations, protests, and the familiar trappings of power. What began with hope has turned into a story of sharp decline, and the fall of one of the continent's most powerful women in politics. From unexpected ascent to unchecked power, Suluhu assumed the presidency in March 2021, an historic moment, the first woman to lead Tanzania. Early on, some observers saw a shift. The draconian tone of her predecessor softened. There was talk of opening media space and engaging more with civil society. But critics argue that the veneer of reform was thin, and that over time the patterns of fear and control returned with new intensity. By 2024 and into 2025, the signals had become unmistakable. Laws passed earlier in the year expanded the responsibilities of the electoral body, but critics noted it remained tightly aligned with the ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, CCM. Meanwhile, independent voices describe a tightening grip, political opponents silenced, space for dissent shrinking, and the architecture of democracy altered from within. The 2025 election: coronation or choice? The presidential election of 29 October 2025 was meant to be Suluhu's first full electoral mandate. Official results declared her the winner with approximately 97.66% of the vote, a figure so enormous that it raised immediate international concern. The two major opposition candidates had been disqualified in the months prior. Tundu Lissu charged with treason, Luhaga Mpina barred on technical grounds. On polling day and thereafter, protests broke out across the country, including in cities such as Dar es Salaam, with roads blocked, tires burned, curfews imposed. An internet blackout was in place. The offline world mirrored the freeze on genuine opposition participation. Human rights groups documented abductions, arbitrary arrests, and enforced disappearances, while government authorities rejected the counts of lives lost as highly exaggerated. This was a critical turning point. Not just an election, but a moment where the promise of change cracked wide open to reveal a familiar architecture of dominance. The strong woman myth and its unraveling. For many years, the image of Suluhu as a strong woman leader was potent. In a region where male dominance in politics remains the norm, her ascendancy looked like progress. But strength, unchecked, breeds fear. As the halls of power consolidated, decisions became more unilateral. Opposition voices fainted, corridors of accountability darkened. The notion that a female dictator could lead Africa may seem contrarian, but the convergence of gender and authoritarianism became part of her unraveling. Reports suggest that under her watch, the very systems meant to restrain power, media safeguards, independent institutions, civic space, were bent or broken. Economic and regional stakes. Tanzania's economy under Suluhu had looked promising. Infrastructure pushes, regional trade engagement, and a drift away from isolation. Yet beneath the surface, several red flags emerged. Aid flows tightened, civil liberties were in decline, and investor confidence began to flicker. The 2025 election did not happen in isolation. It came amid a backdrop of regional realignments and rising expectations across Africa for responsive governance. Her scores on infrastructure and regional diplomacy remained talked about, but they paled beside the rapid erosion of trust. Citizens who had hoped for an inclusive future now found themselves in a system that looked more centralized and less accountable. The early signs of collapse. The fall of Suluhu didn't come in a single flash. It unfolded in stages. First, the key opposition leaders were neutralized. Lissu jailed, Mpina excluded. Then, the election happened under tight control. Then, protests flared, internet and communications were restricted. Then, the world watched as official claims of over 30 million votes for Suluhu made even the most seasoned observers raise eyebrows. When a system is so visibly tilted, legitimacy is eroded. The months after the vote revealed it. Youth-driven protests, economic pressures on ordinary citizens, and a once prominent leader facing growing isolation. even if outwardly she remained powerful. Why this matters: Tanzania's trajectory has broader implications for Africa. A woman reaching the summit of politics should have been a sign of progress. Instead, what many now see is a cautionary tale. That power, without accountability, corrupts regardless of gender. The reactive model of governance, fixed on maintaining dominance rather than enabling participation, has shown its limits. For Tanzanians, the stakes are real: freedom of expression, the ability to choose leaders, respect for human rights, and the prospect of a future where the state serves rather than dominates. Suluhu's story touches on all of these. As the dust of Tanzania's October 2025 election settled, one reality became impossible to ignore. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, once celebrated as a unifying figure, now stood on the edge of political isolation. The same people who once cheered her calm composure now filled the streets with chants demanding accountability. Her presidency, once hailed as a breakthrough for women in African politics, had become a case study of how power reshapes its holder. The protest that shook Dar es Salaam. In early November, Dar es Salaam, Dodoma, and Arusha became the nerve centers of a nationwide uprising. Demonstrators from all walks of life, students, vendors, clerics, and opposition loyalists, gathered under the banner of Sauti ya Watu, the people's voice. What started as peaceful gatherings quickly turned chaotic when police fired tear gas and live ammunition to disperse crowds. Dozens were arrested. Videos of unarmed civilians beaten by security forces spread across social media before the government enforced a full digital blackout. Within hours, the internet across Tanzania slowed to a crawl, and several journalists were detained for what authorities called false reporting. International human rights groups called it a direct assault on democracy.
The aftermath of 2 days of protests in Tanzania as opposition parties challenged Wednesday's presidential election. Turnout was low, but unrest soon broke out, with demonstrators setting fire to a bus and petrol station and vandalizing police stations and polling centres. 2 people died. The government responded by shutting down the internet, imposing a curfew and deploying the military to the streets. Main opposition leader Tundu Lissu was imprisoned before the poll, charged with treason for calling for electoral reform. Luhaga Mpina, the presidential candidate for the second largest opposition party, was barred from running. On Thursday, the country's electoral commission declared that President Samia Suluhu Hassan's ruling CCM party had taken an early lead, with just under 97% of the vote in a handful of constituencies.
From legitimacy crisis to leadership vacuum, Samia's government continued to insist that the election was fair and that foreign-funded agitators were destabilizing the nation. But behind closed doors, insiders began to leak information to the press. Ministers frustrated with the president's inner circle, alleging that decisions were made without cabinet consultation. Several senior CCM figures quietly left the country for medical trips abroad, avoiding association with the unfolding crisis. Analysts began to describe what was happening not as reform or revolt, but as regime fatigue, a slow implosion of trust between ruler and ruled. The more the government tightened its grip, the faster the opposition movement expanded underground. The role of the military and regional response. The Tanzanian People's Defense Force, TPDF, maintained a visible presence on the streets, assuring citizens that its loyalty lay with the Constitution. Yet reports surfaced of divisions within the ranks, some officers questioning orders to use force on civilians. Meanwhile, regional allies such as Kenya and Uganda stayed cautious. The African Union called for dialogue but avoided condemning the election outright, while the East African community urged calm and constitutional solutions. Still, there were cracks in the facade. Behind diplomatic statements, whispers grew that some leaders feared Tanzania's turmoil could spill across borders, affecting trade routes and regional stability. Western embassies froze select development grants pending investigations into election violence, sending a chilling signal to Dar es Salaam's financial markets. A woman surrounded but unyielding. Despite mounting pressure, Samia remained defiant. In her first post-election address, she described the unrest as a temporary storm stirred by enemies of peace. Yet, those words failed to calm the streets. Every attempt at justification only seemed to deepen the sense that Tanzania's first female head of state had lost touch with the very people who once celebrated her humility. Even some of her earlier supporters, women's organizations, faith leaders, and civic reformers, began to withdraw their endorsement. One prominent activist told reporters, "We wanted her to succeed because she represented us, but power consumed the symbol." Economic and social ripple effects. The political crisis soon turned into an economic one. Tourism, one of Tanzania's major revenue sources, plummeted as foreign advisories urged travelers to stay away. The shilling weakened, inflation climbed, and small businesses struggled as curfews restricted operations. Factories in Mwanza and Morogoro reported layoffs due to supply disruptions. Young people, who once formed the heart of Samia's digital-era optimism, now led protests demanding jobs, freedom, and transparency. Their message was blunt. "We were promised reform. We got repression." A turning tide in Africa's leadership narrative. Across the continent, Suluhu's story sent shockwaves. Once considered a model of moderation and inclusion, her rule became a warning about what happens when democratic gestures mask authoritarian instincts. The same regional leaders who had praised her diplomacy during peace talks in the DRC and Rwanda now avoided mentioning her name publicly. In African capitals, political analysts debated a new question. Could the fall of Tanzania's most powerful woman leader reshape the continent's conversation about leadership, gender, and accountability? Some argued that Samia's failure would unfairly discourage other women from rising to power. Others countered that her downfall proved leadership qualities should never be judged by gender, but by integrity and the willingness to listen. The silence before the storm. By December 2025, reports suggested a growing split inside the ruling CCM itself. Younger members began demanding party reforms and calling for an internal audit of the election process. Rumors spread that the former foreign minister was rallying support to challenge Samia in the next party congress. Security around the president tightened. Opposition voices claimed she was considering emergency powers to extend her rule. Yet, for all the official control, the tone of her leadership had changed. The aura of invincibility fading under the weight of public discontent. The fall of the feared. In the end, history may remember Samia Suluhu Hassan not as a dictator in the traditional sense, but as a symbol of unfulfilled promise. A leader who rose on the wings of reform and fell by clinging to control. Her story is not just about one woman's failure, but about a nation's struggle to reconcile stability with freedom. The fear she once commanded is now replaced by frustration, and the quiet strength that once inspired Tanzanians has turned into a reminder of how thin the line is between hope and disillusionment. As the world watches, one truth emerges. No leader, no matter how powerful, can outlast the collective will of a people determined to be free. If you followed this far, what do you think about Tanzania's political future? Do you believe the fall of Samia Suluhu marks the beginning of a new democratic awakening in East Africa? Or just another cycle of control and rebellion? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the work by liking this video, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories shaping Africa's future.